Today's webinar will be covering varying hole spacing and column and joist connection enhancements. My name is Laura Hackle, and I'll be covering how to take advantage of the varying hole spacing, extension plates under base plates for columns, and how to set up SDS2 to use non-standard beam gauge joists or beam gauges for the joists. You can type in your questions throughout the webinar and I'll answer them at the end. For varying hole spacing, in 2016, it now gives you the ability to use varying hole spacing for shear, clip angles, end plates, and bent plate connections. Design calcs will reflect the variable hole spacing and will include the bolt's center of gravity checks. So the first one that I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this connection and just turn it to an end plate. Oops, sorry about that. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to the end plate. And we have vertical hole spacing. So right now it's just set at 3, and if you just want that spacing to be at 3, you can leave it at that. Otherwise I can uncheck it. And this will be the center to center distance that will be separated by commas. So right here I'm going to put in, I want my first center to center distance to be at 3. My second one, I'm going to put a comma. I want it to be at 6. And then I want it to be at 3 again. So if I click OK, and I snap to the surface of this, we see from here the center to center is 3 inches, the center to center to here is 6 inches, and then the center to center is 3 inches. Like I stated, if you want them all to be 3 inches, you can just leave it at 3 instead of typing in 3, 3, 3, and so on. You can also have them at the @ symbol. So if I come up here and maybe I'm going to snap to the surface of this, and maybe I want 2 of them to be at 3.5 inch spacing, then I want a 6 inch spacing, and then I want the rest to be at 3.5 inches. So I can just edit this. I'm going to go to my near side clip, my vertical hole spacing. I'm going to uncheck that. So like I said I wanted 2, and then the @ symbol, 3.5. The spacing does not matter here if you put spacing after the commas. And then 6, and then comma again, and then 3.5. Now you'll see that I only put in for this amount, but if I click OK, I have 2 at 3.5 inches, then I have a 6 at a 6, and then I have the rest at 3.5 inches. Even though I put only at 3.5 for one of them, it put out one more because it needed that to make my connection. Now if I came in here and maybe I said I only wanted 5 rows, if I go to my near side clip again, and for my rows, if I uncheck that and put 5, you'll see that it contradicted itself. So it's saying that the locked rows is less than the required for my extension clip angle. So I would have to change that back to 6. You can't have both there. So if I uncheck that, click OK, now it's stating that I'll get my system connection there. I can also change it here. If I have my vertical brace going into a beam column connection, I'm just going to go ahead and snap to the surface of this. So I can change it for this actual clip angle here. So if I just double click on that component and I go to my near side clip, I can change that for my vertical hole spacing. I could change that to 3, 4, maybe 2.5. So I have my 3 inches center to center, 4, and then I have 2.5 there. So like I stated, right now you can only do it for shear, clip angles, end plates, and bent plate connections at this time. Moving on to the next thing, we have extended plate stiffeners. 2016 will now provide extended plate stiffeners under the base plates when a column frames to a beam with narrow flanges. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to change this column here that's sitting on top. I'm going to change it to a W10 by 54. Now you'll see that it provides the stiffener there. If I snap to the surface of this base plate, then I'm just going to go ahead and measure this. So from the edge of the base plate to the edge of the stiffener, I have it at 1 1/8. And then I also have it from the edge. Oops, let me go ahead and add a construction line in there. But it's going to be at 1 1/8 as well. So we have 1 1/8. So that's reading off of my setup. And if I have in my setup, if I go to my options, fabricator options, standard fabricator connections, and then extended flange plate setup. And if I click on the help menu here, here's our setup information for the extended flange plates. We have our minimum plate thickness, and then the maximum plate thickness. We have our minimum plate length, and we have a minimum plate width. So the length will be running parallel to the beam flange, and the plate width will be running perpendicular to the beam flange. We also have our plate clearance parallel to support and plate clearance perpendicular to support. So like I had there, the 1 1/8 from what I measured. And then we also have our plate overhang tolerance. So the plate overhang tolerance will be the horizontal distance from either edge of the column base plate that is parallel to the beam's flange. And then it will be measured in the plane of the beam's flange. So let's say I just put in something crazy right here. I'll just put in 4. And we also have our beam stiffener. I can clip the beam stiffener. So I can have it clipped or just a straight one. And then we also have our minimum non-cope length. So it'll be the distance from the outside corner of the stiffener plate that is nearest to the extended flange plate, to the corner where the stiffener plate begins to taper. So I put in 4 here and hit OK. I'm going to rotate out. Just mark this for processing. So now that I had the tolerance there at 4, it's stating that from my setup, it's reading that I do not need that stiffener there. So if I go ahead and edit that column, and let's say I change this auto standard, I'll change it to an auto base cap plate and then go to my connection specs. Now we have our use extended stiffeners, right now it's set to automatic. I can turn that on to yes to overwrite my setup. And now I still have that stiffener there, even though it's stating that the system said that I did not need one from my setup. You can also have 1 or 2 pairs of stiffeners. So if I edit this column again, maybe I increase my load to maybe 40. Oh, let me go a little higher here. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna try. There we go. So if I increase that to a higher number, then I see that it'll put in the 2 stiffeners there. Now you will see that it does not bolt to the stiffener, but it's only going to bolt to your actual flange there. Another thing that we have, I'm just going to open up and put in a couple columns here. By 54. And then I'm going to go back into my setup and change this back off of, I'm just going to put my plate overhang tolerance back to 1 and mark this for processing. Oh, whoops. Drop that back down. And now you'll see that it puts in a shared stiffener for those columns. It's 1 shared stiffener for now. Or now it is 1 shared stiffener. Another thing that we can control is the auto base cap plate edge distance. So if I go ahead and snap to the surface of this cap plate, go ahead and add in some construction lines here and just measure it. Right now it's at 1.25 inches for my edge plate distance, and that's controlled in my options, fabricator options, standard fabricator connections, and then cap plate setup. And then here we have our edge distance. Right now it's at 1.25 inches. Maybe I want that to be 1.5 inches. Click OK. Mark it for processing. And now it moved out that 1/4 inch. Currently this is for universal and not just by bolt size, but there is a PR requesting this. Next we have our column plate welds. So I'll go ahead and open up my ISO. And let's say I wanted to have the same plates for my HSS and for my wide flanges, but then I want my wide flanges to actually have a 5/16 inch weld. So if I edit this column here, and I have in my bottom end settings, I have my column plate welds. So now you can control this in your member edit screen. So I'm going to click on Show Images here. So for our column plate welds, we have our location face A. Right now it's at a single fillet at a 1/4 inch. Maybe I want this to be at 5/16. And then here we have our stated for, let's say, I'm going to change the rest of these to be 5/16 instead of a 1/4 inch. And maybe my location inner for my near side face A, let's say I put this at a single fillet and I realized that I actually did not want this weld. Right now you can't zero this out, so I couldn't hit 0 and tab. It's going to say my weld size must be greater than 0. So all you have to do is actually just put in a size and then just take it off of the lock. So you just can't put 0 in now. You can just put in an actual number and then just take it off the lock. So I have the 5/16 inch weld here, and then I could just go ahead and save this as a user-defined connection. Maybe I'll just call this wide flange 5/16. And then weld, and click OK. So right now, like I stated here for my weld type, right now we only have a single fillet as an option. So I'll just click OK. And then if I edit this weld, now you'll see that it's at a 5/16 inch. Then I can go ahead and apply that to the rest of my wide flanges. Just changing the weld will not change the piece mark for the base plate. So just changing this weld is not going to change the base plate piece mark. We also have extension fields for base plates. So this would be all the more options that are in the plate definition schedule. So I applied BP2 over here, just created a base plate, and maybe I want to add just for this one, I want to extend it off to the left and extend the bottom. So if I double click on the column, and I'm going to go on my left hand side, in the tree there's a left base plate extension. Like I stated, it's going to be what's also in your more tab for the base plate definition schedule. So if the left plate or left base plate extension, if I double click on that, for my leg length, maybe I want that, I'll just put in 6. I want 1 column. My horizontal, the first hole, I'll just put 8. My near side bolt rows, I'll just have 1 for my near side. So I'm just filling this out here for what I want on my left plate extension. So I have my left plate extension, and maybe I want to add a bottom extension as well, so I can just double click on that component. The same thing show up. So if I go to my bottom base plate extension and double click on it, for my leg length, type in 6, 1 row again. So this will all be the same fields. Click OK. And now I built that plate inside the plate, or inside the actual member edit screen. And then you'll see that this now is not the same piece mark. It changed to its own piece mark. And then I could also save this as a user defined and go ahead and actually copy that around as well. And the last thing we have is the non-standard beam gauge for joists. In 2016, it includes additional setup options to set up non-standard gauges for joist connections framing to wide flange and channel beams. So if I go inside my options here, I have fabricator options, standard fabricator connections, and then I have my joist setup. Here I have my alternative gauge for supporting wide flange beams. So I'll check this on if I want to use it as my default gauge. And then here, if the flange width range is from 0 or equal to and up to 3 inches, my gauge I'll have be at 1.5. And then since I put 3 here, it starts off from 3 to, maybe I want that to be 5. I want this to be 2.5 inch gauge. From 5 to 7, I'll put at a 3 inch gauge. From 7 to 9, I'll put at a 4 inch. And then 9 and above, if I just leave this at 0, that would be everything above 9. I could put at a 4.5 inch gauge. You can have the same thing for channels as well down below. So if I click OK here, I'm going to go ahead and mark this for processing. And then I'm going to change this to bolted. And if I snap to the surface here, and I'm going to do construction line add material for the beam and the joist. So I'll just go ahead and erase some of these construction lines here. Alright, so you'll see that this is not on the gauge line of the beam. I moved that off. So if I measure, the flange, it's at 6.5 inches. So I stated in my table that from 5 to 7, I'm going to use a 3 inch gauge. So if I go ahead and just add in a construction line here and measure that, from here to the center of that beam, it's at 1.5 inches, so that would be half of my gauge of 3 inches. So you can move that off of the gauge line in the beam from that table in the setup. So that concludes today's webinar that covered varying hole spacing, extension plates, and how to set up SDS2 to use non-standard beam gauges for joists.